Everybody. Obviously, I'm not here, so we're gonna do a little. Make sure you guys are copying this down into your guided notes um, that was passed out to you yesterday in class on juvenile justice. I know the past couple days we've been talking about this with a little station activity. So we're gonna talk about today some of the similarities, some of the differences between the two systems. All right. So first of all, let's go into kind of the history of the juvenile justice system. Technically, a juvenile is considered the age of 18. Or, under the age of 18 uh, is considered a juvenile. If you're 18 or over, obviously that legally ends parental and state legal authority over a child. In terms of most states recognize that as age 18 as a cutoff point. And one of the beginnings of this, because way back in the day, they I think back to your U.S. history classes, during industrialization, early part of the 18 and 1900s, it really wasn't that way. Juveniles, they at one point they treated juveniles and adults the same way. However, in the early to mid 1900s, progressives, again, U.S. history class, began to reform that and started thinking about things a little bit differently in terms of how they view child versus adult. So some progressive reforms of the 20th century began focusing on public education. Again, think back to your U.S. history class, industrialization. A lot of children worked in the factories. They had manual labor jobs. They worked in industrial settings. And as more progressive reformers started getting started started getting elected into public office, uh, they started banning child labor, so shifting from the work environment into schools. As I said before, many states began restricting child labor. And then ultimately, in terms of the juvenile justice system, began to establish its own separate entity, its own separate system from the adult. And then one of the reasons behind this is because of science. Psychologists began studying adolescents. They began seeing differences between adult development versus child development and how the minds think. And ultimately, the government began taking on the parental role, so to speak, of a child in terms of confirming that difference between a child and an adult. So a couple things. 19th century reform kind of have the two main theories, two main philosophies. You have the humanitarian philosophy, where we look at rehabilitating the offender. I know we've spent some time talking about this already in class with the prison system and bail, about how the job of the justice system is to rehab the individual, education, counseling, things of that nature. Whereas the old style of format, I guess you could still argue, this is still around today. You have that control philosophy that the goal of the justice system is to punish the offender. So if somebody breaks the law, your job is to punish them, not rehab them. So they give these two very different thoughts that kind of came into play. So minimum age for juvenile systems. So 16 states have set lowest age of juvenile court. So for instance, North Carolina. So this is minimum. Technically, in the state of North Carolina, 6 years old is the bare minimum in terms of possibly taking part in the juvenile justice system. So it means if you're 5 years old or younger, the juvenile justice system would not apply to you. And then same thing for 7 years old in Maryland, Maine, New York. 8 years old, Arizona. 10 years old will be Arkansas, Colorado, and you could obviously do that for yourself. So all the other states would be, from that, 17 years old to 11 years old is where most states fall, including Ohio. Now the maximum age for the juvenile justice system, again, most have it. You guys see it here, 17 years old. 38 states, most of the states in our country have the maximum age of 17 years old. However, you do have some states like New York, Connecticut, Carolina. 15 years old is the max. So if you're 16 or 17, you could be tried as an adult in a lot of cases. So again, it goes, in terms of, state requirements, it varies from state to state in terms of, how they view a juvenile. So obviously that's something that's a little bit different and can vary depending on where you live. All right, so some major differences. Okay, so we just spent time talking about this in class with the adult system. So the goal of the adult system is to hold the person accountable. Again, you do have to read the Miranda rights to the adult. That is a requirement. You do have rules of criminal procedures as well. The trials are open to the public, right to a jury trial. So that's, again, a constitutional right. Age of 18 at the time of the offense. Exception, the first degree murder, if you are 16 or over, that could apply to you in terms of being tried as an adult. DUIs, sentencing. There are sentencing guidelines that judges have to follow, and obviously you have your jail and prison time as a form of punishment for the adult. Now, juvenile system, the goal of the juvenile system is to rehab the child, because again, the child is not done growing. How they think at 13, 14, 15, 16 is probably how they're going to think differently when they're 20, 30 years old. So rehab that person. Second thing is, yes, whether you're a juvenile or adult, Miranda rights still apply. You need to be remembered or reminded of your rights through the Miranda, plus some extra steps that need to be taken, whether it's parental, to inform the parent that the child's being held, etc. Now, there are rules for a juvenile protection procedure, which is a little bit different from an adult. And here's another big difference is that while adults are open to the public, children are not open to the public. They're usually closed. For one, you want to protect their identities. Kind of as you guys did in station activity, you don't want something to happen when you're 14, 15, 16 years old to haunt somebody for the rest of their lives. So you typically try to conceal their identities. You do have no right to a jury trial, but there are exceptions. Again, same thing. You don't want the person who's 16 being part of the jury. We have 10, 11, 12, 13 people exposing the identity of that individual. So typically, judges take the rules in these kind of cases. Obviously, age under 18 at the time of the offense would be juvenile, and then you get indeterminate sentencing, where the judge has a lot of leeway and more options in terms of how they sentence the individual. And then there's many disposition options. You typically want to have least restrictive towards a juvenile, whereas adults are less than that. All right, so I'm gonna stop there really quick. All right, that. All right, so there's two types of juvenile offenses. One is delinquent offenders. These are youths that have committed acts that would be crimes if committed by adults under federal, state, or local laws. So again, murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape, molestation, aggravated sexual battery, armed robbery. So these are things where really there is no age thing. They're crimes that could be committed by both juveniles and adults. And then you have your status offenders. These are only crimes that are committed by youths. They cannot be committed by adults. So, examples of status offenses: running away from home. That would be something that would be a juvenile thing. Skipping school, violating curfew, refusing to obey parents, underage drinking. Again, those are things that are only juvenile that are juvenile offenses. Adults can't be charged with that. So those are examples of status offenses. All right. So again, juvenile versus adult justice term comparison. So notice the terms in here are a little bit different. So in a juvenile term, you don't call it a crime, you call it an offense. A lot of it is due to the language. Crime sounds really bad, and so that's an adult thing. Whereas a juvenile, you typically try to pare down the language a little bit. For one, you don't want these things to harm kids long term. So that's typically why you kind of pare down that language. Adult term, you say you're arrested. In a juvenile term, you're taken into custody. Adult term, file charges. Juvenile term is petition. Adult term, if you make a plea of not guilty, then you're denying the charge. Juvenile term is admission. Adult term, guilty. Adult term, you say a trial. The juvenile term is kind of pared down a bit more, where you have different things. You guys did this a little bit in your station activity, and a adjudicatory hearing, and it's a trial for adult. You're found delinquent, means you're guilty. A disposition would be your sentencing hearing. Um, if you're going to jail for an adult, the juvenile term would be you're in detention, very similar to what the term is in for school. Um, and then obviously if you're given parole, that would be your aftercare for juvenile. So again, just notice the language is different. It makes it sound a little bit less harsh, where you get that stigma against a child by hearing some of these things. It's just different. All right, so juvenile rights. So juveniles have the same rights as adults do when taken into custody. So obviously you have the right to a parent, guardian that has the right to be contacted immediately. The parent, guardian, and you can request an attorney before questioned by authorities. You have the right to be represented by a lawyer. The right to not be placed with adult offenders. So if you are in the adult system or juvenile system, so this is why you have that, to be placed not with adults in that setting. And then you also have the right to have your names and photographs not made public. So this is why when you see the news and you see so-and-so who's age 16 was charged with whatever, they don't release names, they don't give photographs in the media. Again, for the privacy reasons, because you're still a juvenile, again, they don't. A big part of it too is that they don't want the stigma hanging over you for the rest of your life, something that you did when you were young. Juvenile or adult. Children over the age of 14 can be tried as an adult. Again, these are in extreme cases. You'd call that a transfer or a waiver hearing is needed. So before that were to happen, the judge would hear a case called a transfer or waiver hearing. And that's where the judge would consider the juvenile's past record, the seriousness of the crime. Again, you're talking about really bad examples of crimes. And then ultimately the big question is that can the juvenile be rehabbed? So again, all those things can be considered in that. And there's something called the Galt case. Supreme Court ruled that juveniles do not get bail. So obviously the goal is to not keep them in prison. The goal is to get them out in custody of their parents until their trial, unless there's, again, extreme cases. You have the right to an attorney, that open to the public media, and there's no juries. Again, you want to keep the privacy of the juvenile intact. And if you have a jury, that can taint that. All right, so juvenile process. One, you're taken into custody, very similar to an arrest or an adult. So they call it the intake. So booking/intake. Informal process where court officials determine if a complaint against a juvenile should be referred to juvenile court. Again, you guys did this in your station activity. You interview the youth and consider the seriousness of the crime, past record, family situations. So the options would be you would release the individual, the judge would release the juvenile, or you would refer them to an alternative program until the next step. Step number 2, you'd have your initial or detention hearing. This is the first court hearing that you would have for the juvenile after taken into custody. State must prove the offense was committed and accused did it. So again, there's no bail for juveniles. So again, options here, you could be referred to criminal court where you can be found delinquent. If you're found delinquent, that means you're detained. The prosecutor of the case may apply for a waiver hearing to try the juvenile as an adult. Again, depending on the seriousness of the crime. So all these things happen in this stage. Or you can go the juvenile justice route. Case can be dismissed. You can be put to a diversion program, like you guys saw with like Scared Straight, community service, things of that nature. Or it can be released into parents' custody until your next step. So you can see this here. It should be like your intake. And then you would have your adjudicatory hearing. This is the juvenile trial where a judge analyzes the facts of the case and makes a judgment. This is more of a fact-finding case. It's closed to the public. You're entitled to an attorney. Now the judge option, we have 2 options here. At this stage, you'd find the defendant non-delinquent, which means not guilty, or you find the defendant delinquent, which means guilty. So I'm going to stop here because the time's going to run out. I'll start a new video.